Hello, this time on Sitrep.
The Russians are expanding many of the brigades near the Finnish borders into divisions. In the areas of northern Norway, Finland, the Baltics, we're talking about probably even tens of thousands of troops.
Is Russia preparing for war with NATO in the coming years? We've certainly heard plenty of warnings from our own leaders that it's possible, so Mike will explain what Russia's doing to reshape its military capability, even as it continues to fight in Ukraine. And we'll hear from Finland about new evidence of a slow but steady Russian build-up close to the border. Also on Sitrep, the Armed Forces Complaints system is still deemed not efficient, effective or fair for the 9th year in a row. But the Complaints Ombudsman tells us things are getting better. And Donald Trump wants a new winged White House. An RAF veteran tells us what it's like on board Air Force One and what goes into making this flying fortress.
Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
Germany's defence minister is the latest to declare his country needs to be ready for war as a worst-case scenario. But Boris Pistorius' deadline is 2029, a little more optimistic than General Sir Patrick Sanders when he was head of the British Army last year, who set the date at 2027. Mike, is there hard evidence that beyond Ukraine, Russia is seriously considering the possibility of a war with NATO?
Well, there's no hard evidence as such, but there's a great deal of circumstantial evidence, and everyone's playing around with, potential dates. Interestingly, the International Institute for Strategic Studies just this week issued its own report saying, really agreeing with General Sir Patrick Sanders, saying that Russia could be ready for a military operation against a NATO country within 2 years if they get themselves out of the immediate fighting in Ukraine, not 5 years or 10 years. And the point is, Kate, I think, no country said we are preparing for war with our neighbours as such. But what the Russians do say, they say this very explicitly. Medvedev, the previous prime minister and previous president, said only last week, he said, NATO talks about peace through strength, but we believe in peace through fear. That's what he said. Peace through fear, because we can see that peace through fear works. And what that means is that, in effect, the Russians have given up on peaceful coexistence. That's what we had during the Cold War. And they draw the conclusion, look, we did peaceful coexistence for 30 or 40 years and we lost. We lost the competition. That's what the Chinese say. They say, we are not going to do peaceful coexistence because look at what happened to the Russians. They lost the competition. And so the Russians have given up on peaceful coexistence as an assumption for the future. They believe in peace through fear. And when you have peace through fear, then the possibility of reinforcing that fear by invading an area or taking an area or threatening to take an area is pretty high.
So, Mike, can you just talk us through what the circumstantial evidence is of their building up that capability of peace through fear?
Yes, I mean, they're spending 8% of their GDP on defence. The Russian Air Force is not badly stretched by the Ukraine war because they're not putting him out there. I mean, the Russian aircraft very, very seldom fly over Ukrainian airspace, so they've kept their Air Force in good shape because they think they might need it against NATO. The Russian Navy's in good shape, and they are, as it were, re-equipping their armed forces. They're taking their armed forces in total from 1.3 million to about 1.5 million. And the Russian army is planned to expand both geographically and in terms of numbers. And that will take a bit longer because the army's taking most of the strain in Ukraine. But undoubtedly, the Russians are building up the other elements of their forces, as they have been for some years. And Putin, I mean, long before the Ukraine war, back in 2012, 2013, 2014, when he was doing these State of the Union addresses, which I remember seeing, he used to spend all of his time either running a film of all Russia's new military technologies. That's what he wanted to do. His State of the Union was really about all of the new military stuff that he is bringing online. And that was 10 years ago. And so a lot of that material is now, I mean, a lot of it isn't as good as he said it would be, but it's all coming to fruition now. They've got a lot of new, sophisticated, high-end missiles, drones, aircraft, and other systems, which they're now making potential use of.
And Mike, Russia, of course, would argue that it's improving its defensive capability against a growing and, as it sees it, aggressive NATO, irrespective of what they say about peace through strength or through fear, I should say. Is there evidence of the Russian intent being solely aggressive?
Well, no, it's not solely aggressive, but it is based on a sort of a national paranoia. And it's based on momentum, because Putin has built up his power as a war leader. I mean, as people have been saying quite a lot this week, he's fought 5 wars in 25 years. You can count them off, starting with the Chechnya War in 1999. So this is his 5th war in 25 years. And with each war, he becomes more dictatorial. Russia becomes more of an autocratic state where dissent is not permitted. And so he's got a war economy, a momentum of growing forces. He needs war to maintain his power. That's the reasonable assumption to make. And in that respect, is it solely aggressive? No, it isn't. But war for him has become a survival mechanism for his own power base. That's the problem we really face.
And is it possible to separate out what Russia is doing to develop its military capability because it's fighting a war right now in Ukraine and what it's doing for potential future war?
To a degree, yes. I mean, a lot of what the Russians are doing, of course, is being poured into Ukraine, certainly for ground forces. But you can see the way they're reorganizing. They're thinking in terms of consistent military confrontation with the West. That's not how they thought 10 or 15 years ago, but it is how they're thinking now. And they are restructuring for that in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah, on that note, the restructuring, a couple of years ago, there was this reorganisation of Russia's military districts. Can you just talk us through the detail of that and what it tells us?
Yeah, there used to be a Western military district, which is a very big military district for the whole of Western Russia. And then in, February last year, February 24, they divided that back up into the old military districts of the old Cold War. So there's a Leningrad military district, which looks after Scandinavia, the border with Finland and all of the northern areas. And then a Moscow military district, which is responsible for the area through Poland and Ukraine and into, what we would think of as southwest Russia. And those 2 military districts have become much more active, giving them, as it were, a specific wartime role rather than this rather general Western military district, which was abolished at the time. And then there was also the Northern Fleet, which of course is still in existence, is still a powerful fleet. But the Northern Fleet used to be designated as a district in its own right. There was a kind of a Northern Fleet district to look after the Kola Peninsula and so on. That's been abolished. And so the Leningrad and the Moscow military districts are now, as it were, war-fighting divisions or division of the country into war-fighting areas that armies can be redistributed to. So that was what was really interesting about that, because previously the Russians had orientated themselves towards Central Asia and the East, towards China. You could see that the Western military district was basically the quiet zone, and the Central Asian and Eastern zones were the more active zones. But last year, no, they reversed again. And by creating these old military districts and giving them more autonomy, in effect, military autonomy, they were moving their expectations back to Western Russia, not to Central and Eastern Russia.
And to add to that, this week media around the world, including the Wall Street Journal, have shared satellite images which seem to show Russia slowly but surely building up its military presence close to the border with Finland. Probably not a surprise given Russian reaction to Finland and Sweden joining NATO last year. Some coverage drew comparisons with the visibility of the military build-up before the Ukraine war. But what do these images say to you?
Well, there's 5 new bases being opened up or developed. I mean, one is Kaliningrad, of course, which is in the enclave in Lithuania, which has been there all the time, and that's being built up. But there's also 4 others, which are, in a sense, being reopened. I mean, the most interesting is Severomorsk, right up in the north, and that's an old Air Force base, Russian Air Force base, which is being redeveloped. And then there's Alenia, another Air Force base. Petrozavodsk, which is now looks as if it's being built up for armoured vehicles, and what's the other one? Kamenka. and Kamenka is also being built up. And all of those 4 bases that I've just mentioned are all effectively along the Finnish border. Now, some have said, well, that's quite alarming. Others have said, look, this is more like a Potemkin village. There's not much there at the moment. And there isn't. But clearly, the Russians want to show that they are aware of the change in the strategic environment that Finland joining NATO has produced. So this is to be expected. It doesn't look, to be honest, like the build-up of forces before Ukraine in 2022, because they had 190,000 troops on exercise all the way around the border. This is nothing like that. But they are now, as we're reactivating or reopening bases that they previously had regarded as unimportant, but now they're becoming more important to the Russians.
Well, Emil Kastehelmi has been studying the satellite images. He's a co-founder of the Finnish open source intelligence group Blackbird, and he joins us from Lahti, a city in southern Finland. Great to see you, Emil. Thank you for your time. Can you just start by giving us an overview of the images that you've been analysing?
Well, there are multiple Russian brigades located in border regions, so to say, of Finland and also northern Norway. Currently, the amount of singular changes which can be seen from the satellite images, there have been a number of them, but nothing very radical has yet been observed. So what we can see is like a gradual development, maybe some adaptation to some potential Ukrainian drone threats in the northern air bases, and so on. So that's mostly it. Maybe one exception is the military base at Kamenka, where the Russians have erected about 130 or 40 tents, which have been there since last spring.
And how many sites are we talking about in total that are being developed?
Maybe something between 10 or 15 currently.
That many, okay. So you say it's very gradual. Is there anything that's standing out in terms of buildings, in terms of equipment that you're seeing?
Well, in most places, of course, from the ground forces, the equipment has been transferred to Ukraine. But then again, for example, as I mentioned, in Kamenka, the tents are an indication of growing military activity. There's a growing need of accommodations. So that's at least one change. It seems that it's related to an ongoing training effort which exceeds Kamenka's normal capacity. And the accommodation there isn't really for, or likely isn't really for, a singular larger military exercise. It's probably because of a larger effort to train more troops, also for the war in Ukraine.
And are we talking about existing military sites being expanded, or are these new sites that are being set up?
Currently, we're seeing present military sites which are being expanded, renovated, and so on. The Russians are expanding many of the brigades near the Finnish borders into divisions. They are also bringing new army corps near our borders, likely somewhere in Karelia, maybe in Petrozavodsk. So there may be a need for totally new construction also. They likely will reactivate these rundown old garrison areas from the Cold War. There's a lot of possibilities how the Russians will do this, but the largest changes are yet to come, I think, because the Leningrad military district was re-established just last year, so it's understandable that they will first make the organizational changes, as the forces are tied in Ukraine, they don't need to have everything ready very fast. So, yeah, I think this summer and in the coming years we will see more of this.
When you say that Russia is expanding its brigades, do you have an idea yet at how many more troops we're talking about that are being stationed in the area or close to the Finnish border?
Well, in the areas of northern Norway, Finland, the Baltics, we're talking about probably even tens of thousands of troops, depending a little bit on how the Russians will do the organizational reforms. So it's a significant number, and it's maybe returning a little bit towards the situation that was there during the Cold War. After the Cold War in 2000s, there's been a relatively limited amount of Russian troops near our borders, but that's definitely changing now as the larger geopolitical framework is changing too.
And how far from your border is this build-up happening?
It really depends. There are bases located, well, the nearest ones are maybe dozens of kilometers away, roughly speaking. But then again, there's also places hundreds of kilometers away, especially in the north. But when we're talking about air bases, when we're talking about bases with strategic bombers, which can fire cruise missiles, for example, it's a relatively short distance. For example, from the Olenia airport, strategic bombers take off to missions to fire cruise missiles to Ukraine. So the war is also happening near our borders as we speak.
How much concern is this causing in Finland?
It's of course causing some concern, but basically the media is pretty well contextualizing these changes. So I wouldn't say that we are at least not very alarmist here. We are, of course, observing the changes, but we're also well equipped for any possible scenarios. And especially as we're a part of NATO, we are stronger than before.
And what's happening on Finland's side of the border?
Well, of course, Finland is also developing its capabilities, adapting to new phenomena that have been observed from Ukraine. Of course, also, as we are in NATO, we are integrating our systems. There will be new headquarters elements. There will be more international large-scale military exercises and so on. So we are not building any new for example, we won't establish a new brigade that will be very near the Russian border or anything like that. But basically, we, of course, here in Finland, the officials are observing the situation, monitoring the situation, and then adapting to every change in the threat environment.
But it is fair to say that you are strengthening your border defences.
Of course, we are strengthening our defense forces. We are investing more money. The military budget is growing and so on. So, yeah, one could say that we are also definitely preparing also for the worst, as one has to be when we are a border nation next to Russia.
Emil, it's been really good talking to you. Thank you very much for your time today. Emil Kastehelmi.
Thank you so much.
Mike, we've talked before and we'll inevitably talk again within the next few weeks about the big picture of our military preparedness for war. One of the interesting things talking to Emil is it reminds me of those countries that border Russia have a very different mindset, don't they? How important is that going to be for our defence review when it finally comes?
Well, I think the defence review is about the general nature of our defence capabilities. I doubt if it will be talking about any sort of deployment issues or whether we should concentrate them here or there or whatever. I mean, those are all, as it were, decisions in the nearer term. The defence review is about what our forces need to look like in the 2030s and how we get to where they should look, how they should look in the 2030s. So I doubt that there'll be very much reference to Northern Europe. But quite aside from the defence review, the politics of Northern Europe and the way those countries see, as you say, their security challenges is very similar now to the way we see our security challenges. And as we've said before, there's an increasing divergence of view between the North European states and the South European states about what their security agenda really is and what the most important things are. And undoubtedly, when you look at the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all of them, of course, were conquered by the Soviet Union in 1940 in the Russo-German pact that set off the Second World War. Then they were occupied by the Soviet Union in the Cold War period. They only became independent in 1991, and they really fear Russian either conquest or so much Russian interference in their politics as to make them unviable as states. And so I think, Britain recognises that issue, and we are building our defence much more around, I think, Northern Europe. And the question for the defence review will be, are the things that are laid out in that defence review, are they consistent with the geopolitical decisions which the government is going to have to make sooner rather than later, i.e. this year and next year, for the next 5 to 10 years? Is the review consistent for the 2030s with what we know we're going to have to do in the mid-2020s?
Mike, some of those nations neighbouring Russia are already doing some of the most basic things. They're laying thousands of dragon's teeth tank obstacles, but also another change of mindset. Finland, along with Poland and the Baltic states, have all said they're going to pull out of the Ottawa Treaty, which bans anti-personnel landmines. That feels like a big step back in time.
Yes, it does. I remember when the Ottawa Treaty came about, it was all, 1997, 1998. And it was undertaken in a great sense of optimism that, anti-personnel landmines are really a weapon of the old world, and the military affairs don't move in that direction anymore, certainly not in the Western world. And I remember we were commissioned when I was at King's College to do some research for an international charity about the utility of anti-personnel landmines. And we said they have very limited utility, but the utility is not zero. And the charity wasn't happy with our conclusions at all, because they wanted us to say they have no utility. And we said, well, that's not true. They don't have much utility, certainly for Western forces, but they do have a residual utility. And here we are in 30 years later. And the utility for some nations is really quite high. So they have a very high utility for Ukraine. They could have a very high utility for these nations of Northern Europe who think they may have to resist an old-fashioned Second World War style ground invasion. Mm-hmm. And if you're on the defensive against ground forces, then anti-personnel landmines do make some sense. We never thought they'd be this relevant, but yes, they are.
Yeah, and in this case, sad that you were right in this situation, Mike. Do you think the UK could pull out of that treaty too?
I doubt it. I mean, we could, because other people will, for good military and humanitarian reasons, to be honest, to defend their territory. But we may not, because it's not likely to be so important to us. We are not likely to find ourselves trying to defend our own ground, or even the ground of our own forces, in quite the same way. And our contributions to NATO defence are more likely to be in the air and the maritime area than in the ground campaign, even though the ground campaign might be very important. So I think we'd be under less pressure than some of our partners in Northern Europe to pull out of the treaty. But you can't rule it out, because we're now entering into a different world militarily and politically.
Now, we've spoken at length on many occasions about how the service complaints system has badly let down some of the men and women of the armed forces. And yet again, in the annual report of the Service Complaints Ombudsman, the watchdog says the system is not efficient, effective or fair. Despite that, and some of the past stories of terrible failure, a disproportionately high number of women, the Ombudsman says there's been significant progress, and she believes servicemen and women can have confidence in the system as it stands today. But Mariette Hughes has been telling me that delays are making things much tougher than they need to be, not just for those who complain, but also people who have complaints made against them.
Over the last 3 years, there's been a consistent rise year on year in the number of admissible service complaints. And on top of that, we had mass complaints raised last year around one particular issue. So we need to be able to adapt the system to be able to deal with that continuing influx of complaints. Because every time an improvement is made, it's then almost immediately eroded again once the number of complaints goes up by orders of magnitude.
What was that particular issue that caused mass complaints?
So this issue relates to the accommodation offer, specifically single living accommodation. And there are currently, I couldn't give you the exact number, but there are over 3,000 complaints that have been submitted on this issue. And just to put that in context, the number of complaints that were received last year on this issue is the equivalent to 3 entire years of the whole service complaint system landing all at once. Now, it's quite right that those individuals are able to raise them as service complaints. They are individuals who feel wronged by a situation, and that is the correct method of raising those. But the system itself isn't designed to absorb that. So the way that's been addressed is that the Ministry of Defence has started to design a bespoke process to deal with those complaints. Because when you have complaints at that level coming in, you need to make sure there's consistency in the way they're being looked at, the way the outcomes are being recorded. But it is an issue where we've seen a huge influx into the system, and the system just isn't designed to adapt that quickly to that unexpected level.
And when you consider the improvements that you say need to be made in terms of the efficiency of dealing with complaints, what kind of effect is it having on servicemen and women involved and for the services as a whole?
So one of the big issues in service complaints is people who don't even come forward, who don't want to raise their complaints at all. And we know from years of looking at the surveys that when individuals say they've suffered a wrong but they did not raise a service complaint, one of the key drivers they list as reasons why they didn't raise it is because they thought the process would take too long. And that's really distressing for me, because I've been saying for the entirety of my tenure, we can't fix things unless we can see them. And so when individuals choose not to raise service complaints because they do not want to engage with a process that will take so long, I absolutely understand that position, but it's a really dangerous situation for the services to be in, because so many things are then going under the radar. We also face the issue that in many cases, when a complaint relates to perhaps a relationship breakdown in the workplace or behaviours of another individual, many people don't want to put themselves back in that situational vulnerability, and they don't want to deal with the amount of time that that complaint will take. And as I mentioned earlier, those specific complaints do take longer. Quite frequently, in my experience, they will look at how long they have left in a particular role or a posting and how long the other individual has left. And if either of those are less than the average time they could expect that complaint to take, they will just decide to deal with it, knowing that they will move on and it won't be their problem anymore. The real concern for me is that that doesn't fix the problem. It just moves the problem.
And in terms of service personnel having confidence in the system, that the bullying, the harassment, the discrimination complaints, they seem to be some of the most serious complaints and seem to be getting the least effective hearing, though.
They are, the levels of trust and confidence that individuals have in the service complaint system are low, and I would say they are lowest in those sorts of complaints. We can see it in things that have happened recently in the media. We can see it in sort of outpourings on social media where people have talked about their experiences trying to raise issues and not having had them heard correctly. And, you know, we can't shy away from that fact. In the past, cases like this and complaints like this have been handled poorly. One of the big issues for me is getting over that historic hurt and how the system was, because the system has improved. There are a number of elements that are much better now. So, for example, previously you would have to go directly to your chain of command, to your commanding officer, with your printed Annex F form in hand and explain to them all the ways that someone had wronged you and sit face to face and discuss that. We still use the same complaint form, but it can now be submitted online, and it goes to a centralised admissibility team where a specified officer who does not know you, does not know your career, and does not know the individuals involved, they are the only person who can tell you whether or not your complaint should be admitted. So any suggestion of bias, any suggestion of undue influence at the submission of the complaint, that really critical moment where people have chosen to stand up, that is so much more independent now than it ever was. Unfortunately, people will often share their, well, not unfortunately, sorry, people will often share their experiences of historic complaints. And it's really hard to get across that it would be different now, because it's real to them. It was their experience, and I don't want to discourage anyone from sharing their experience where it has gone wrong. But for the majority of cases coming forward now, they would expect a much better level of service. I say the majority, there are still cases where it goes wrong. That is where my office steps in as that independent oversight body. But the improvements have been made at the front. Having said that, there are also issues in, when we talk about the way complaints are handled, one of the key things I see is around use of tone, use of language, and really being able to relate to the things that someone has gone through in a complaint of this nature, which can be really difficult, really distressing. So we provide training to all decision bodies and appeal bodies across all three services on how to remember that people are people. And that might sound a little bit like sucking eggs, but I think there is a danger when we get into service complaints, when we get into formal complaint determination letters, that we start to use very elevated language. We start to try and be cut and dried and black and white with everything. But in complaints like this, when we're talking about bullying, when we're talking about harassment, when we're talking about how someone has treated you as a person in your place of work, you can't be black and white on that. You have to recognise the personal element.
I'm wondering, you've been in this position now for 4 years yourself. I wonder, do you ever feel like a broken record having to say again that the system isn't doing its job?
Only when I have to do things like that, I come out with sound bites and I wonder, how many times have I said this over 4 years? Genuinely, no. I mean, as you mentioned, it is frustrating sometimes. But it's frustrating because I care. And I think if I weren't frustrated sometimes by the lack of progress, that would be a sign that I needed to no longer be doing this. We are seeing new changes every day. We are seeing an unprecedented level of sharing and effort put in by the Single Service Secretariat to work with me, to work with my team. And that's what invigorates me. So yes, I do sometimes feel like a broken record when I'm writing yet another report saying, no, it's not efficient, effective or fair yet. Sorry, but we're nearly there. But we genuinely are nearly there. And it's small little things and slightly different things each year that are preventing it.
That was Mariette Hughes talking to me earlier. Mike, talking to her, I mean, I really got a sense that she knows what she's about and she's actually making a difference. And I did come out of that conversation feeling significantly more positive than I did going in.
Yes, and I think Mariette Hughes is absolutely right. It's all about confidence, the confidence of the armed forces in the system or systems that exist. I mean, the systems can be as good as you like, but if people are not confident about them, then they won't really work. And that's the important thing, because we all know that the armed services, the individuals in all the armed services are bound together by a mysterious sort of force which people outside the armed forces never really fully understand. And the mystery of that sense of duty and comradeship and commitment and professionalism, all the things that you and I have a good sense of, even though we're not really part of it, those things are all based on confidence in each other, confidence in the system, confidence that you're doing a very dangerous job, but that the service will do its best to look after you. And when it comes to complaints, where that confidence is broken down or didn't exist to a high enough degree, then it has to be built up. And so, all power to Mariette Hughes's job. She's trying to, as it were, put an element back into that mysterious power which binds the armed forces to each other and to their service, because it has broken down in the past, undoubtedly, and it's got to be put right.
And there will be people saying, you've just been talking about getting ready for war. You need to keep your focus there.
Yes, indeed. And to get ready for war, the most important element are the people. We all say that. It's an old cliche, but it is. And if the people don't have confidence in their system, in the organization that they support and that they put their lives on the line for, then they simply won't perform as well or as professionally as they should. So, being prepared for war means making sure that of all of the elements that go into making war or war fighting, the most important element, the people, are the best you can hone them, the best you can train them, the best you can encourage them to be.
Well, Mariette Hughes and I talked in much more detail about how things can be further improved in the complaints system, including the creation of a new Armed Forces Commissioner next year, which will open up a route for families of service personnel to submit complaints as well. You can hear it in an extra edition of the Sitrep podcast online now. Now, finally, Donald Trump stopped briefly in the UK this week at RAF Mildenhall for Air Force One to refuel. He was en route to the Middle East for his first big tour of this presidency, but Air Force One overshadowed it all at the start because President Trump said he was going to accept a new plane for the job to be gifted by Qatar. Mike, of course, Air Force One is the call sign of any plane carrying the US president. There are 2 aging 747s that currently do the job. But the idea of him accepting a new plane from Qatar, it hasn't gone down well, has it?
No, except by him and his family. It's a 400 million 747. It's one of the 747-8 series. I mean, I love the 747. I regard it as the last of the great machines of the Newtonian age. The last of and it changed life on this planet. Cheap air travel. The 747, it first flew commercially in 1970. Boeing built more than 1,500 of them, And they went through the 200 series, the 400 series, getting bigger and bigger. And this is the 747-8. Not many of them are built. And 2 of them are Boeing aircraft, which are meant to be the new Air Force Ones. And the president's got very fed up because Boeing is taking years to do these and they're very, very expensive. And here are the Qataris who run a 747-8 series aircraft, presidential level aircraft, and they're going to gift it to him. Even then, it will take some time to get it ready as Air Force One because it has to have all the defensive aid suites. It has to have an operating theatre in it. It carries copious amounts of presidential level blood, the right blood type for the president. And so you can't just sort of take it on and have the president use it because of all the other things it has to have with it. But nevertheless, this 747-8 is the biggest, the noisiest, the tallest, the stretchiest of all of the 747 series. So, of course, Donald Trump loves it.
Well, former RAF pilot Scottie Bateman knows a lot about Air Force One and what goes into making it so special. Scottie, welcome back to Sitrep. Good to see you again. Just tell us how you got up close and personal with an Air Force One plane and another destined to do that job in the future.
Oh, well, I was so fortunate to be commissioned to do a documentary for National Geographic Disney Plus about the building of the new Air Force One, the one that is still being built at the moment. And as part of that documentary, I got the privilege to spend probably about 6 weeks with the Presidential Airlift Group and flew on it a couple of times.
Yes, and on board one of the current Air Force One planes, what was that like?
Well, it's like going back to the 1980s, actually. The current Air Force One aircraft were built in the early 80s and came out then. And, you know, they've got things like a peach bathroom still, which is a very throwback to the 80s, but they are immaculate. The paneling is amazing. It is the ultimate luxury, as I think President Trump likes to call it, and it is a beautiful aircraft, but it's aging now. I mean, these aircraft are over 30 years old and need replacing. Hence, when President Trump was in his previous administration, he got some new aircraft to be built, second-hand aircraft as well. Those aircraft that he bought were second-hand out of the desert. They were destined for the Russian airline, Transaero, which most people probably don't know. So those aircraft were bought and destined to go to Russia, were bought out of the desert by President Trump for a very low price. He got a fantastic deal on those airplanes. And then they went to San Antonio to be refitted, to be the new Flying White House, and they are still in San Antonio being refitted. And I think that's what's leading to his frustration, is that there is the potential that he'll be out of office again, and they still want to deliver those airplanes that were, envisaged and the deal was done in his previous administration.
I can almost imagine those feet stamping there. I guess any suitably sized plane could be converted to that kind of luxury, though. What makes it special, though, is a lot of the kit that we don't see. What can you tell us about that?
Oh, well, the airplane isn't a standard airplane. So the airplane is, in the case of the current ones, was built from scratch. In the case of the new ones that are being built now, are taken back literally to the metal and are rebuilt from scratch. Everything from the wiring has to be different. Every component has to be shielded against a nuclear blast, which isn't normal on the 747s that you see flying around with passengers or cargo on board. And then it is really built with all this communications equipment. The engines are different because they have to have more power, because obviously the amount of power that this airplane draws to run its defensive suite, to run its television studio. The new one will have a television and radio studio on board, and all the communications equipment is so much more than you would need for a commercial airplane. So it's massive amount of extra work, years and years, in fact.
What about weapons? Does it carry weapons?
And nothing offensive. So it doesn't carry any offensive weapons. Obviously, the president, wherever he flies, is well protected. I think that's about all the Air Force will say about it. But yes, there are defensive suites on there, and those are, you can see them on the outside of the airplane. I'm not telling you it has lasers, it has chaff, it has flare, it has all the things that you would expect a military aircraft of that size and type to have.
In terms of defence, is it all up to Air Force One, or does it always fly with escort jets for extra defence?
Outside of the conterminous US, it will fly with an extra escort where it's needed. Obviously, if it's flying over the UK, then obviously that's not needed. But we saw that when it flew into Saudi Arabian airspace, it was escorted by some F-15s, which weren't armed, by the way.
Wow.
If you notice in the video, none of those F-15s had missiles on the rack. So actually, it was almost a ceremonial escort into Saudi Arabian airspace, and that happens quite a bit.
You studied the construction of the next generation Air Force One. So if President Trump were to accept a new airframe as a gift, how long would it take to strip it out, refit it as a flying fortress fit for Air Force One missions?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I think he would have to go through a couple of new administrations before that happens. If we take the example of the new ones which are being built at the moment, they were existing 747-8I airframes, similar to the one that the Qataris are offering him. To strip them down took over 18 months. And that was just to strip them down. That's not the rebuild. So realistically, you're looking at 2, possibly 4 years, if not longer, to get this into a situation where actually it can fit the Flying White House role. And that's before we even start putting any of the extra engines and all this equipment. So from my viewpoint, I think it's unrealistic. It's a really nice idea to just the president jump on this airplane and go flying around. But in reality, I just think it's too complex.
And how expensive do you think it would be?
Well, the current ones are costing $9.3 billion to refit. So I think it's going to cost a lot of money.
So, Scottie, just to finish with, what's your takeaway from making this documentary?
Well, 2 takeaways, really. One, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. So, when you're buying an airplane, buying airplanes is complex. And when you're building something as complex as the Flying White House, now the president can do everything from that aircraft that he could do in the White House. So the complexity of being able to do that in an airplane is enormous. And the one massive takeaway that I took away from it was the people who make it all work, from the crews to the engineers. They'd say they treat it like a classic car, their favourite classic car. They hand polish this aeroplane every day from top to bottom, not with buffers. They actually hand polish the aeroplane. That's why it looks so pristine. So the care they take in that aeroplane is amazing.
Scottie Bateman, always good to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Nice to speak to you again, Kate.
Thanks. And Scottie's documentary, The New Air Force One, Flying Fortress, is available to stream online. You can also read more later this year in his upcoming book, Jumbo. Scott, see you soon.
Bye, Kate.
Mike, Air Force One is a very practical and capable flying fortress. That makes it also very symbolic of power, of course, which I guess also matters, certainly, to President Trump.
Oh, yes, nothing matters more to him than the outward appearance of the power that he wields. But, as Scottie was saying there, I don't think it's likely that this Qatari aircraft, this 747-8 series, will actually become Air Force One. If I had to guess, Kate, I would say that this aircraft will be ready after the end of President Trump's term of office. It will go to the presidential library, as it is constitutionally supposed to do. The 2 747s that Boeing are working on will in due course become Air Force One for future presidents. And in theory, this Air Force One sitting in Trump's library should not be used. Other presidents have had their Air Force Ones grounded as part of their collections, part of their memorial, and it just becomes an exhibition for the public. Nobody believes that this Air Force One, if it goes to the Trump library, will actually be a memorial as such, that Trump will be bound to use it, and he'll call it Trump One, and he'll fly around the world in it, as if it is part of the presidential library. So at least I suppose it gives a whole new meaning to the idea of a mobile library.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to all of our guests. That is all for now. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. In the meantime, you can stay up to date with all the latest defence news on our website, forcesnews.com. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.